response to occur, the receptor must be present and must be actively binding the hormone. Indicated several mechanisms of action. For example, thyroid hormone and steroids utilize they primarily function as transcription factors, don't have to, whereas membrane proteins, membrane ligands utilize a G protein signaling pathway or a tyrosine kinase pathway. And then we also learned that the chemical structure of the hormone to a large degree determines the half-life, mechanism of action, binding, pathway, and so on. We then turned our attention to the hypothalamic pituitary axis. We talked about the anatomy of the neurons and pathways that make up that axis. We talked about the primacy of that system for regulation of all of the other hormonal systems, everything from thyroid hormone to gonadal hormones to adrenal hormones. So these hormones that you're looking at here, you must know thoroughly for the remainder of your career because they're going to be absolutely critical to understanding a variety of pathologies. Many times if the endocrine pathway is not the primary cause of the disease, it's secondary or implicated in some other fashion. And what really complicates and why the endocrinologist makes so much money is because the regulation of the secondary and primary hormones is maintained in a very scrupulous, precise fashion that involves multiple feedback pathways. And it's almost impossible for folks like us to get a full handle on that. The mechanisms of feedback are so complex in many cases that it takes a very experienced individual with a very powerful computer to sort it all out. Recall that with respect to the hypothalamic hormones, we're primarily talking about releasing factors, releasing hormones, so oftentimes you'll see it, by the way, factor and hormone generally mean the same thing. A lot of these substances were identified before we knew what they did. So oftentimes when you see the term factor in place of hormone, it just means that it was identified, they called it a factor, and then later on they figured out its endocrine function. Bob was talking about somatostatin. Do you remember why we don't, why we should not describe 5-HT as serotonin? Anybody remember why that's not the prudent thing to do as a clinician? What is serotonin? How did serotonin get its name? What does that term imply? Serotonin.
Vasomotor.
Yes, and yet we know that serotonin has many other functions, and therefore to give it a name that only suggests that it serves in vasomotor and misleading. Likewise, we talk about growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which would be somatostatin. Somatostatin is all over the place. It's in the GI tract, it's in your brain, it's in your hypothalamic pituitary axis, it's in a variety of tissues and it performs a variety of functions. So it would be misleading to call this hormone, not that somatostatin is that much better, but perhaps growth hormone. In any case, the term somatostatin is preferred over GHIH. But if you wish to use GHIH, that's fine with me. I'll probably do it for didactic purposes. And then, in the bottom here, we have the generally 6 anterior pituitary hormones, and these two you want to be quite familiar with. We're going to be spending some time talking about each of these. We'll discuss FSH and LH in the context of reproductive physiology. We'll talk a little bit about prolactin. We'll talk about ACTH in our discussion of the HPA axis. That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, one that you're going to have to pay particular attention to. And then, because we'll talk about thyroid in just a moment in its own regard. We won't talk much about growth hormone after this, so I'm going to say a few more words about the growth hormone. But again, you need to know all of those hormones quite thoroughly. So I don't think there's any, we've already talked about the anatomy of parvocellular and magnocellular neurons and what they do. So somebody explain to me what we're looking at here. Give me the proper anatomical terms to describe what we're looking at here. What are the green things? More specifically, they are parvo or magno? Parvo. These are parvocellular neurons that release what type of hormone? hypothalamic releasing hormones into, what's this reddish thing here? I guess that's reddish. What is that? The portal system. What portal system? That's correct. The hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, right? How does that differ from the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract? Exactly. Blood vessels instead of neuronal axons. So this is the portal system. Remember the releasing factors, all those hypothalamic releasing factors, including the GHIH, travel down that portal system. Which hormones are moving down or synthesized and then released along the tract? Oxytocin, yeah, oxytocin and ADH. So make sure you know that. So our point was the little green neurons there release their little products into the capillary system. Those releasing factors then travel down to the bottom side, the interior portion of that portal system. That's the anterior pituitary. What's the other name for the anterior pituitary? What? Not the neuro, but the adenohypophysis, A and A. They travel down to the adenohypophysis, and the reason you need to know that is because the clinical literature is just relevant. It is just riddled with references to adenohypophyseal hormones and reactions and pathways. So these terms are not trivial. All right. But in the anterior pituitary, you see the little blue cells, and what are those blue cells? That's correct. Those are endocrine cells. So those are endocrine cells. These are not neurons. The neurons are at the top, and the neurons are releasing factors into the portal system, where they travel down to the anterior pituitary. Those releasing factors, released in very tiny, minute concentrations, travel in this rather closed portal system, and then bind to membrane receptors. By the way, do you remember the signaling pathway that most of those releasing factors use in that table I gave you? Actually, it wasn't in that table. I said you ought to add them to that table. That's correct. PLC pathway. They bind to receptors and trigger the PLC pathway, which culminates then in release of, what is released from those blue cells? These. There you go, the anterior pituitary hormones, which then do what? That's right, they travel into the general circulation. All right, so I want to make sure you appreciate that they're traveling. This is how they get into the general circulation. So those anterior pituitary hormones are in much higher concentration than the hypothalamic hormones, because the hypothalamic hormones, all they have to do is get from here to here. These have to travel throughout the entire body. Most portal systems are venous, and I'm not sure. That's a good question. This is a very low pressure system within a confined space, and by arterial and venous, the problem is that the distinction becomes kind of unimportant in this context, because we're talking about a low pressure system that's probably going to have a slightly lower than normal pH. It'll be a little more acidic for a variety of reasons. So I'm not sure quite how that's best. My guess is that this would be primarily an arterial system, simply because it empties into the general arterial circulation. But I'm not sure that I've ever seen that specified, and I'm not sure, given the nature of the system, that it would be all that important. Certainly in this context, it's not central to the role of the endocrine activity of the tissue. But most portal systems, I don't know, there are at least two others that we may encounter later in the course. Both of those are venous. What are we looking at here? Somebody describe for example, what are the green neurons here? See how they're mixing up the colors? What are the green? Are they No, they're magno. Magno. So don't just memorize colors. Right? So the green, how do we know they're magno? They start up here, and they go all the way down to the posterior pituitary. That's the neurohypothesis where they release those two hormones that we talked about, ADH and oxytocin, into the general circulation. By the way, on a test, if I were to ask you, is ADH a hypothalamic or pituitary hormone? Is ADH a hypothalamic or pituitary hormone? What if that answer is not amongst the ABCD? It's a bit of a philosophical quandary. I just want you to understand that technically these are both hypothalamic hormones that are released into the general circulation from the posterior pituitary. The reason I can say that is because their synthesis is complete in the hypothalamus. At least that's the general opinion. I'm not sure I've always accepted that. But, we normally call them hypothalamic hormones, but they're released from the neurohypothesis. So, Louise, as you look at this, does this help you at all with your question? Doesn't help me at all in answering your questions. All right, let's talk a little bit about those two posterior pituitary hormones that we've indicated, ADH and oxytocin. We've indicated that they're synthesized in the hypothalamus and then passed along that tract, not the portal system, but the tract. And generally we say that they're stored there until a proper signaling stimulus. You can see the example here, and you'll have no trouble finding these animations on the web. The child suckling, for example, would be the stimulus that would promote release of, for example, oxytocin. Now, we have to be careful in differentiating oxytocin and prolactin. Oxytocin, one of its primary effects, is to promote lactation or release of milk. Prolactin is an anterior pituitary hormone that, among other things, promotes production of milk. So two general. We normally say that oxytocin promotes milk let down, or again, release of the milk from the glands. Oxytocin is also important in, I have to be careful with the wording here too, in maintaining the contractions of labor. You will often read that oxytocin is necessary to initiate labor contractions. For example, what do they give a mother to induce labor? Tocin, which is a synthetic form of oxytocin. But they do so in rather massive doses. When we get into the reproductive unit, I think we can make the argument that oxytocin naturally doesn't seem to induce labor. It just seems to reinforce it in a positive feedback fashion. We'll talk about later. I don't know that I want to get into that discussion right now. So oxytocin, very important in lactation or milk letdown, maintaining the contractions of labor. And also, this is probably where you've heard about it most recently, a very important neurobehavioral substance. By that, we have found that oxytocin levels go a long way to determining how you feel about the people sitting beside you. If I were to artificially increase your oxytocin levels, you would feel a lot better about the people sitting beside you. You'd get all warm and fuzzy. Oxytocin is very important in maternal and paternal behaviors. We find that a father who just had a child, oxytocin levels go up, testosterone levels go down, especially if they're in direct proximity to the child. Sounds like adaptive behavior. So oxytocin's all good, right? It seems like it's such a wonderful, socially reinforcing neurobiological hormone. There is one nefarious aspect of oxytocin, though, that has emerged in the recent studies regarding its effect on our behavior. It makes us much more xenophobic. What do we mean by xenophobic? If the person sitting beside us is not like us in some important way, then we the oxytocin may intensify animosity. So it seems to promote familial attraction and within-group attraction. You might, with oxytocin levels go up, you might start feuding with the nurses or something. I don't know. So that's oxytocin. Those are the three primary functions. And then ADH we're going to talk about later, but I do want you to know its general function now. By the way, it goes by a variety of names, antidiuretic hormone. What do we mean by diuresis? Urination. All right, so an antidiuretic hormone would inhibit urination. So ADH is very important in conserving the body's water. So it inhibits urination along with some other medications. It's also called arginine vasopressin because it also has effects, among other things, it has effects on blood pressure. It acts to elevate blood pressure indirectly. And we'll talk about how that works when we talk about renal physiology later. So this is just a brief diagrammatic summary of all these, or some of these hormones we've talked about and their sites of activity. ADH acts, for example, on the kidneys. Oxytocin and prolactin both have effects, among others, on the mammary glands. The gonadotropins, as we're going to see later, act upon the gonads, the ovaries and testes. TSH on the thyroid, MSH on the skin, growth hormone on muscle and skeletal tissue, and so on. Now, what we're looking at here is a cross-section, a transection, axial section of the pituitary gland, and you can see sort of histologically the two different regions, or actually three regions. We won't get into the argument four. We're only looking at two. We need to worry about two. The posterior, the neurohypophysis and the adenohypophysis. We've indicated what hormones are released from the neurohypophysis. Remember then, from the anterior pituitary, from these endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary, a variety of hormones are released. They're released from specific populations of cells. By that I mean there is a specific cell that releases growth hormone, a specific cell that releases prolactin, and so on. Those cells, for whatever reason, whether we like it or not, generally are termed tropes. So for example, in the illustration of the examples I've given you, thyrotropes in the anterior pituitary release TSH, not TRH. Gonadotropes release FSH and LH. Lactotropes, prolactin, and so on. You should know that the most abundant type of cell in the anterior pituitary is the somatotrope. So if the anterior pituitary were stained, I don't know if I have a slide here, I guess not. If the anterior pituitary were stained for growth hormone, you would expect considerable staining of the anterior pituitary because there's so many of these somatotropes in this tissue. And then you should remember this one. What is PONC? Yeah, ACTH, yeah, ACTH. So whether you want to tell me the corticotropes store ACTH or PONC, fine with me either way. We won't quibble over that. Now this is a slide that you might want to enlarge. It just reinforces what we've been talking about, but you want to be thoroughly familiar with the points that are rendered in this overview of endocrine physiology. We're looking at the hypothalamic pituitary hormones, the relationship of those two. And then we're going to be talking about primary hormones. You can see in the little blue region down here some of the primary hormones. The primary hormones would be hormones like estrogen, like testosterone, like thyroxine released from the thyroid gland, cortisol released from the adrenal gland. And then in the green at the very bottom, we can see that a lot of these primary hormones act on either specific tissues or in some cases, take for example thyroid hormone, on just about every tissue in your body. Growth hormone, likewise. So what we want to make sure we understand in looking at this illustration, we make sure we understand these are the hypothalamic, these are the pituitary. These are sometimes called target or primary hormones, so I'll just call it primary there. And then these are the tissues that are influenced ultimately by those primary hormones. Now there are going to be some exceptions here. There are going to be some that don't fit the pattern, but that's the general sequence. Do you remember our discussion of disuse atrophy? So as thyroid hormone levels are elevated, what's going to happen to TSH levels? They're going to drop. Sorry. And you can see how complicated this gets quickly. As thyroid hormone levels increase, what's going to happen to TRH levels? As this goes up, what happens to TRH? They go up or down?
Down.
Down. As TRH goes down, what happens to TSH? Goes up. As we lower the levels of TRH, this goes up. All right? As this goes up, that goes up, driving that down. You see, in other words, you have a bit of a paradoxical effect of this on this and this. And that's why you need an endocrinologist and a powerful computer to figure out how all this works. If you want to measure thyroid, you as a PA, you're going to be doing a lot of this in your blood workups. They will go over this with you extensively later on. If you want to get a first indication, a first approximation of thyroid function, which of these hormones do you think is most important? Which one do you think are you going to look at first? TRH, TSH, or T4 and T3? Which is most illuminating? TSH? TSH. So you might be asking yourself, what might I assume if TSH levels are high? Does that say anything about the concentration of these? TSH is high, that might be because there's an insufficiency of this. Everybody see why? Because there's an insufficiency of inhibitory feedback. This is why you need the endocrinologist and powerful computer. But I do want you to understand the general relationship, the idea that there's going to be a driving force from the top to the bottom. So the hormones on the top are going to drive release of the hormone toward the bottom. But then we also know that there's inhibitory feedback from the bottom to the top. So this is what I was talking about. I just want to make sure, and sometimes we make a distinction between long loop feedback and short loop feedback. In general, the feedback between the primary hormone and the hypothalamus, or for that matter, the pituitary, that's called long loop feedback. So the long loop feedback is between the primary tissue and the secondary tissue. Short loop feedback is between the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Which is more important? All depends. No simple rule there. Now, I think I asked you this before. I think we've established that some of you need your pituitary glands removed. How are we going to do it? What's the best avenue? Yeah, we're going to, here we go in through the nose there. We're going in through the nose. We chop out the back of the nose there, because what's that going to allow us to access as we chisel out the back of the nose? Yeah, but that gives us access to the sphenoid sinus. And what's on the other side of the sphenoid sinus? The pituitary gland. I don't think there's any volume. Yeah, maybe it's talking about it.
Cultural realm be elevated and removed with a shaver, as seen here. The lower bone is then removed and preserved.
Notice how gently he does this.
Bilateral sphenoidotomies are now well visualized, and the inferior portion of the base of the sphenoid is removed, as is the posterior vulva. This is done with a drill. The intersinus septum is also drilled away to allow complete exposure of the sella. The sella is part of the posterior.
What is the sella he's talking about?
Turcica.
Yeah, the sella turcica, in which the pituitary rests.
Wall of the sphenoid sinus. this point, once complete exposure is obtained, the case is turned over to neurosurgeon Mark Eisenberg.
So notice what he's saying here. He's doing the general carpentry on the outside. Once he gets to the brain, he needs a specialist, and now the neurosurgeon's coming in to take over.
And here, removing the anterior wall of the cella with a kerosene forceps. The dura is exposed behind it. Once the bone is removed, the dura will then be incised.
This person has a pituitary gland tumor.
And a scissor is used to also help remove the window of the dura. The dura is removed here, revealing the tumor behind it, which is now being removed.
Very delicately, as you can see. Grab and rip.
Suction is also required to remove tumor, as are curettes.
Remember, that tumor was in the very small vacuity of the Turkish saddle, so that was actually used for clinoid processes. But what you might imagine is that tumor enlarges and the pituitary gland is in that confined space. It's probably pushing up into the hypothalamus too. So the hypothalamus has been pushed up away from its normal position as well. So this is not a trivial procedure.
We're looking for the arachnoid, which is the brain herniating down to its normal spot into the cella.
Once he removes it, he needs brain coming down to where either should or shouldn't be.
Some tumors removed here with curette. Since there's a small CSF leak, a fat graft will be used. Bone.
Small CSF leak, what does that mean? CSF is dripping out of the nose now, right? And so how are they going to correct it? You said they're going to use a fat graft. Usually they'll pull fat either from the leg or the butt to jam into the nose to stop it up.
It is also harvested and left just below the cella for reconstruction. A piece of fat is harvested from the thigh and placed into the cella.
Doesn't fit, you make it fit.
The bone graft is then used as a fat graft to support the fat.
Boom.
A cottonoid is used to be sure that there's
This stuff comes in
no
handy,
evidence
doesn't
of
it?
leak. A Valsalva maneuver will confirm that fat graft's in place. Small piece of surgicells placed over the fat. Then
That's-
Duracell is placed over this to
Which is a
seal it.
methacrylate superglue that is put in there too.
The case is now completed.
Roll it home.
The turbinates are returned to their normal anatomical position. No packing is required.
There you go. No worry about cleanup, you just go about your business. All right, I said we want to talk a little bit about growth hormone. So remember, growth hormone is one of these anterior pituitary hormones we will not have occasion to talk much about later, so let's talk a little bit about it now. It's, remember the somatotropes, I have PROPH here. Let's sort of address that issue. These terms are used interchangeably. These suffixes are used interchangeably. They shouldn't be biologically, if you go to your high school or college biology, they have very different meanings. But they are. So in the previous slide, we talked about somatotropes. Here I'm talking about somatotropes, but we're talking about the same thing. So remember, the somatotropes are the most abundant cell in the anterior pituitary. Now, growth hormone is said to have, it has a broad spectrum of effects. We generally differentiate the direct and indirect effects. So the direct effects occur when the growth hormone is released from the anterior pituitary, travels around the blood, and then binds to receptors in the target tissues. Chiefly, for example, the bone, the cartilage, and the skeletal muscle. That would be the direct effect. All right, everybody got that? The indirect effect occurs when growth hormone travels down to the liver, binds to the receptors in certain hepatocytes, causing release of IGFs, IGF-1 in particular. I would prefer to avoid that, but I would agree with you, yes, exactly right. When you say secondary, I would probably use the word trophic, because it's promoting release of another hormone, and that would be basal, it would be the rest besides. But yeah, I would not disagree with your use of that terminology. Growth hormone is a little bit abnormal in another respect. It is a water-soluble hormone. It is a small peptide that a large portion of which, you can see about a third, normally travels in a bound form. The binding protein is actually very similar to the receptor. And the general explanation for that is that it acts to prolong the half-life of this water-soluble hormone. Remember, peptides and amines have generally short half-lives. So growth hormone, in part by virtue of its binding to a chaperone, has an unusually long half-life on the order of 20 minutes or so. I have in the box here that normal growth and development requires ample levels of GH. But what I want you to understand, and I think I'll make this point again in another slide, is that we call this hormone, we call this peptide growth hormone. It is important for you to realize that many hormones are essential for growth. Insufficient thyroid hormone impedes growth. Insufficient insulin impedes growth. Insufficient estrogen, insufficient testosterone, they both have effects on normal growth. So growth hormone is not the only hormone that modifies developmental growth. Indicated it's a peptide, you don't need to worry about the number of amino acids. It is very similar structurally to prolactin and a reproductive hormone called chorionic somatotropin, which is of interest to you only because of something we talked about earlier. Remember that term? What is that? That's a little smiley face there. What is cross-reactivity? It's when hormones of similar structure bind to the same receptor, depending upon their relative abundance and the relative abundance of the receptors. So what we're saying is you might expect, especially some cross-reactivity between growth hormone and prolactin. It is, when we say that it promotes growth, this, if you remember your biology, growth in this context implies really two general biological phenomena. It means developmental changes from birth to adulthood, but growth in a biological context means actively mitotic. It means it promotes cell division. It can be used, you explain this, what this means to me, used medically to address childhood developmental issues. When would that be true? You're the PA. I'm a parent. I'm coming to you. I'm telling you my child is very, very short for their age. What can you tell me? In some cases, so part of your burden, when you take the pediatrics course, for example, is to sort out when growth hormone might be appropriate, under what conditions might it be useful, and when it is not appropriate. You just can't apply it in all conditions. And by the way, who are you? I'm the parent. Who are you to tell me when my child is too short? So you've got to be sensitive to that type of thing too. I might think that's a perfectly normal situation. Again, part of the context in which you must operate. This is of interest to me, less commonly for older patients, to promote vitality. Anybody ever heard of the Life Institute? Yeah. What do? They get as many old people as they can, put them into corrals, and just shoot them up with growth hormone all day. And you can see these 90-year-old people just jumping. They're like doing 26-foot long jumps, jumping over heads. Incredible. Of course, there are problems with that. The growth hormone has not been shown really to do all these things that the Life Institute would have you believe. So you know what this means, GHRH and GHIH, so those are the two primary hypothalamic regulators of growth hormone. You should know that growth hormone peaks, I say here early in sleep. It actually continues at fairly high levels into the non-REM stages that tend to come at the end of your sleep. So let's say, again, you're a parent and you're required to put your child on the school bus at 6 o'clock in the morning. Might that have any adverse consequences? Being a child, they're going to want to stay up as late as they can, even if you tell them it's bedtime and you leave them in their room, they're probably in there playing with their cell phone and so on. So when they get about 6 o'clock, might that have any consequences for their growth? Yeah, could be. A lot of medical authorities now argue that we shouldn't be having kids, especially in adolescent years, follow these bizarre schedules. Now, the other problem we have, and this Bob mentioned something about this, we have all these terms that sound very, very similar. So we've already talked about somatostatin. What is that? What is that? GHIH. GHIH. What is somatotropin? That's GH. So somatotropin is another term for growth hormone. And if I didn't put these in the notes, I should have, because you see them all the time. This is a more clinical term of somatomedin. Somatomedins are the IGFs. IGF-1, for example, is a somatomedin. It's acting as an intermediary between the growth hormone and the target tissue. Now, is this clear? Everybody understand these definitions? And let's go back to that slide. Look at this one. It's yet another one. Somatropin, which is the synthetic form of this. What is that? Human growth hormone. I have to specify that because you take it for granted, but anybody familiar with Premarin? What was Premarin? Huh? Yeah. Yeah. Where did the mare come from? Horse, yeah. There are humans, fish hormones have been used in the past just because they were readily abundant. Hormones from cadavers. So all kinds of hormones. Nowadays, everything can be sort of synthetically fashioned. We sort of make these distinctions now because some of these hormones are from natural sources and some are from synthetic sources. Sometimes it makes a difference. Sometimes it makes a big difference. So we've already talked about some of the effects and the factors that enhance or alter release of growth hormone. Remember, we talked about synergism. We talked about permissivity. Androgens tend to increase the release of growth hormone. That's why oftentimes these professional athletes will be caught up in a sort of maelstrom of taking anabolic steroids and growth hormone because they tend to have a synergistic effect on each other. There are a number of medications. We won't worry about them here. I just want you to be aware that there are drugs out there that potentiate growth hormone effects. L-DOPA, for example, nicotinic agonist. Somebody tell me what a nicotinic agonist is. You've been studying the autonomic nervous system. What is it? No. So that's what it was. Be sure. So an agonist is what? What is an agonist as opposed to an antagonist? Agonist binds the receptor and produces the normal biological response. So can you think of a person suffering from acute nicotinic poisoning? Give me some of the symptoms. What would a person suffering from acute nicotinic poisoning have? What would be some of the symptoms? What would be some of the systems that are involved in such a condition? Okay, would just be sweating? Wouldn't it just, but wouldn't it just be about every aspect of autonomic function? What is the neurotransmitter or the preganglionic pathway in both the SNS and the PNS? Yeah, acetylcholine are the nicotinic receptors. Where else have we run across the nicotinic receptor? Yeah, so you would expect a broad spectrum of effects. Sleep, we've already indicated that that growth hormone is released during sleep, so therefore it's going to be a function of the amount of sleep. We'll talk a little bit about this. Fasting and exercise also mediate the release of growth hormone. What are we looking at over here? Anybody piece this together? What do you know about, what is a GF? What do you know about growth factor mechanisms? Growth factors utilize which of those signaling pathways we talked about? The tyrosine kinase signaling pathway. So we're looking here at one of the more complex signaling pathways, but you can see all of these steps here. This is sometimes called the TKMA-PK pathway, but it's actually about 40 steps in length. They're abbreviating it even there. But it culminates in what? Whoops, can you see at the very bottom there? Transcription. Yeah, this is a mechanism by which a growth factor utilizes one of those complex intracellular signaling pathways, ultimately just to modify transcription, intracellular transcription, changing perhaps the nature and quantity of proteins that are produced. All right, let's take a break and we'll come back and finish up growth hormone.